Well, I think that's a first, being introduced to the musical number. Should have put that down as a first there. So I'm going to talk to you for the next little while about solving layout problems with CSS Grid and some of its friends. And these are some of the things about me and places that you can find me. I'm on Twitter as @RachelAndrew, and that's my website, rachelandrew.co.uk. And in the context of this talk, what's probably most useful to know is that I'm an invited expert to the CSS working group, which means that I get to spend time a few times a year sat in a room with other people arguing about sort of the size of margins and so on. So I'm kind of part of making CSS, as it were, though I'm not to blame for all of it. Now, I've been talking about CSS Grid Layout for over 5 years at this point. I got very excited when I first saw the spec in an early form, and so I sort of made it my mission to go around and tell people about it and hope that eventually it would get into browsers. And earlier this year, CSS Grid Layout shipped in several of our browsers into Chrome and Firefox and Opera and Safari, and it's about to ship in an updated form into Edge. And as I go around and tell people about Grid Layout, the kind of top question I get asked at this point is, don't you realise that Flexbox exists? Can't you do all of this stuff with Flexbox? And at some point, I'll be able to take this piece out of all of my talks, but it's such a sort of top question, I like to try and answer it. So defined in the grid specification is the biggest and most obvious reason why we might want to use grid rather than Flexbox. Flexbox has been designed as a one-dimensional specification and grid as two. So one-dimensional means, do I want to lay something out as a row or as a column? Whereas two-dimensional is, I'd like to lay these things out in rows and columns at the same time. So here's a quick example. This is a flex layout. Now this would grow and shrink to distribute content according to the available screen width. And if you look at the last row, there are fewer items, and so they've just split the space. That's what Flexbox does. Every time we wrap onto a new row, the space distribution happens across that row, as if it's a completely new flex container. And that's layout in one dimension. We're just worrying about the rows. How many things fit in this row, and let's just spread them out along the row. You can't easily line the things up at the bottom with the things above, so making, say, box 9 there line up underneath 1 and 5. If you want to line things up in columns, what you actually need to do is start breaking the flexibility of Flexbox, to start setting percentage widths on everything so they all line up next to each other. So this is doing the same sort of thing with grid. And you can see the same kind of layout. In a browser, this would grow and shrink with the browser window, but the items are lined up here in rows and in columns. And that's what we mean by two-dimensional. You can get both of those dimensions at once. And this is the key thing with grid layout. We're working from the container in. We're saying, here is my grid, it's got these rows and columns, and I'm going to put things into them. Whereas everything else, we don't work like that. Everything else, we work on sizing the individual items and then kind of pushing everything around so it looks like a grid. So let's have a quick look at that. This is a simplified float grid example. Now, pretty much the bare bones of any float-based grid system. So sort of older versions of Bootstrap and Foundation were doing this, and other things that do floats. I think Suzy was originally float-based and worked like this. So you have row wrappers because you need to clear things. So you have a row wrapper and you put your things inside that wrapper. And then you use percentages. So you can have a nice flexible grid. You create these percentages, and then you have to have a percentage gutter as well, using a margin, and make sure that everything adds up to 100%, or it all goes horribly wrong. So we end up with this kind of thing. So we're doing these sort of sums somewhere, whether we do that in SAS or we add it up with a calculator and put it into our CSS, or whether we use calc, we're having to do that kind of math. And the key thing is, there isn't a grid. We're faking the appearance of a grid because we're doing the work of lining everything up. And so what about Flexbox-based grid frameworks? I mean, they exist. There's a lot of them. A lot of people have moved their float-based framework over to Flexbox. And Flexbox does work on the container. You say display flex, The children all become flex items, but they don't become a grid. And to get a grid, you have to add widths to the flex items in some way. And so again, we have wrappers. This time we use the row wrappers usually as a flex container, and then we add widths to the items using flex basis and having that flex basis of auto and a width in the item. So we don't have to do any clearing, so that's an improvement over our float-based layout. And we're able to use the alignment features of Flexbox. That's the key thing, really. If we go to Flexbox, we can use all that nice alignment stuff, so that helps. But we're not really using Flexbox for what it's good at. And we're still doing all of the math. So here we have a grid layout. We're using a grid using grid layout, and we don't have to do the maths. What happens on the item is a simple instruction, just how many tracks should I span? So it's a very different concept. What we're doing here is we're defining the size of the columns when we set up the tracks. We then just tell the items how many columns to span. And there's a few ways we can do that using grid layout, but the sizing is all happening on the container. And we don't have anything else in CSS that really behaves like this. As this is something to remember, the grid frameworks we've got that aren't using CSS Grid Layout, they create something that looks like a grid by controlling item size. Whereas CSS Grid Layout, you create an actual grid and you put your items into it. So CSS Grid Layout is basically a CSS framework built right into your browser. And it isn't any wonder that people are puzzled and keep sending me their attempts at doing grid-based grid frameworks. And they're using row wrappers. They're essentially forcing CSS Grid Layout back into an older model. And the reason we created all those frameworks around the older models is that doing all of that math is boring and error-prone. No one wants to spend their life calculating percentages. So we create frameworks. Then all we need to do is add a class and the right dimensions are applied. We're not having to constantly do those calculations. And we don't need that stuff once we're using Grid Layout. The browser is doing the maths for you. Computers are really good at this stuff. It's much better that they do it than we do. You create the grid and decide how many of those defined tracks your item spans, where it starts, where it ends, and the sizing is worked out for you. Every single abstraction I've seen so far on top of grid layouts essentially just try to force it back into the past. Don't do that. Sort of make this shift in thinking, and then you can really embrace what is coming, in the future with this stuff. And I've mentioned sizing a lot already. Sizing is really important to understand when it comes to grid layout and our newer layout methods. Sizing's been quite simple in the past because we've had to sort of say, well, things they're either going to be fixed, they're going to be kind of in pixels, or we're going to have flexible things with percentages, and we understand percentages. It might be a bit strange numbers to put in your CSS, but we understand it. Sizing's kind of getting more complicated, and we need to know a bit more about how the browser deals with sizing to really take advantage of new layout. If we have an example in grid of as many columns as will fit, and we use two methods here to work on the grid container to enable flexible sized tracks and as many of those tracks as we can get into a container. So we get something that looks a bit like this. So I'm saying grid template columns, and I've got this repeat notation. So we say repeat, and then we've got some brackets. And basically that's just saying, browser, please repeat as many times the pattern that's inside the brackets there. And we're using autofill. I could just put an integer there and say repeat this 5 times. What I'd actually like is the browser to fill as many columns as it can into the container. So I say repeat autofill, so as many as you can. Now, as I said, that could be a number. We use autofill. There's another keyword, autofit. And then we use min-max. Min-max lets us set a minimum and a maximum value for track size. The minimum will be the smallest size we want our columns to shrink to. So in this case, I'd like that to be 200 pixels. The maximum is 1 FR. That's 1 fraction of the available space. The effect of this in our example is that after working out how many 200 pixel columns will fit into the container, the browser will then take the remaining space that's left over, because there probably won't be exactly that space divided by 200, and it'll share it out across the columns. And so we've got this FR unit, which is an unusual looking thing. We don't use that in any other layout method. And it's all about distributing available space. So you can have different FR values for tracks. So in this case, I've got a track of 2 FR and then 2 tracks of 1 FR. So my available space in the container, I'm going to share that out into 4 parts and give 2 parts to the first track and 1 part each to the second 2. So we end up with something like this. Now, what's really nice about these FR units, because they're distributing available space, you can mix them with fixed length units. Now, you can already see I've got a gap in there, which is 20 pixels, so that's taken away from the available space before we distribute the tracks. But we can also have tracks that have got a fixed size. So here I'm saying I'd like to have a 1FR track, another 1FR track, and then a 400 pixel track. So the browser is going to take away the 400 pixels, it's going to take away the space we need for the gutters, and then whatever's left, it's going to share it between those 2 tracks. And so we end up with this. And if the space grows and shrinks, the 400 pixel track will always stay at 400 pixels. It's the other 2 tracks will be growing and shrinking to take up whatever space they've got. And so this is the 12-column grid example that I showed earlier. So the FR unit means you don't need to worry about the fixed pixel width in the gutter tracks. That's just taken away before we calculate how much space we've got for 12 columns. We don't need to calculate those percentages. And so you can see here how the column tracks detailed on the container there. We've got these 12 1FR columns, and they'll just grow and shrink. They could be very skinny columns, or they could be really wide columns. And so when it comes to sizing, I think what often happens when people come, they start using Grid Layout for the first time, because we're working from this old model and we've got this old idea of how layout works, the first thing people tend to do is they try and work out all their percentages, because that's what you're used to doing. Most of the time, the FR unit will replace your need to use percentages, and you can let the browser do the calculations for you. Somewhere where you might want to start using percentages is if you're trying to match up, say, some things that are using Flexbox and some things that are using Grid, and you want everything to line up. So that might be a reason to use percentages. But an awful lot of the time, the FR unit will deal with that for you. And you can replace percentages with that, and then you don't have to worry about something larger getting into the layout and needing to be fixed width and still needing to calculate the space. I very briefly showed you that min-max function, and I want to talk a bit more about that because this is another new thing that we see in Grid Layout. Because once you're setting track sizes, you might want them to be a minimum size and a maximum size. You'd like to have something that can never go too small, but won't go too big, and that's what min-max lets us do. It's really useful for creating these kind of precise-looking layouts that also understand that they're on the web, and sometimes there's more content, or the content is bigger than we expected when we lay something out. So here's an example. This is a panel a bit similar to the sort of panel of photos you get on Facebook and so on. It's sort of a nice little grid. We've got different size photos, and I've also put an introduction to the photos there into the box. Now, that all sort of looks fairly neat, and I want my photos to be a certain size so they all line up nicely. So this is the grid definition I'm using for that panel. I've defined column tracks there, just using the FR unit. And I'm using grid auto rows, and that defines the sizing of rows that grid creates in the implicit grid. So this is, as we add content, if we haven't actually defined a set row, grid will just create auto-sized rows. If we want to define how big those rows that are created, we use grid auto rows. So here I'm saying, well, when you create rows, make them a minimum of 200 pixels tall, but a maximum of auto. And if the row is a size of auto, it'll just expand to take whatever goes into it, which is generally what we want in the web, because we don't always know how big our content is going to be. We won't get any weird overflows. So I'm highlighting the row lines here, and you can see they're growing their to 200 pixels tall, even though there's not that much content in them. And obviously, if something spans over 2 rows, then it's 400 pixels tall. So this is all fine. Everything's going to the right height here because I've got nothing there that is going to force any row larger than 200 pixels. So it looks nice and neat. Nothing's collapsing down to nothing. But then someone comes along and, as always happens, we've done this very neat design. It expects, one sentence of text. And someone comes to the CMS and goes, but there's some very important things we need to say here, and adds some extra content into that box. And that's absolutely fine with grid layout because the box will just expand. And it expands right across the row. So the cell next to it in that row is also going to have to expand. And you can see that here. You can see that now that second row is now taller and is taking that extra content. And so something you'd need to consider with this kind of layout is that everything across the row, if the row is going to grow, that everything will cope with that. So in my case, I've got an image. I'm using object fit, so it sort of scales and fills the box there. And so it sort of will maintain that sort of appearance that I want. Now, it might be that in an ideal world, it should be all nice and neat and even, but this is fine. We can read it. We've not got content cut off. We've not got any sort of weird gaps or anything strange happening, as you might if you sort of tried to use absolute positioning to make this kind of layout. I could use exactly the same technique to add a caption. I've made the figure actually a 2-row track grid and causing the image to span over 2 rows, and then placing the caption in row 2 so it overlays the image. I've given that caption a minimum height of 100 pixels and once again a max of auto, which gives us this. And you can see something here. The captions at the bottom there don't line up. The one on the left has got taller because it's got 2 lines due to our use of min-max. And they're part of a nested grid, so they don't have relationship to each other. We can't ask at the moment the caption for the colourful balloon there to be as tall as the one on the left. And I'll talk a bit more later about this issue of nesting grids and the fact that a nested grid is essentially a completely new grid. It's not got any relationship to the parent at the moment. But before that, I want to continue a little while on sizing, because we've seen that we define grids on the parent, and then we place our content into the cells. We've also seen that content can, to some extent, define the size of tracks. With our min-max, we've put extra content in. It's actually defining the size of that track because we're using auto. You have to remember, though, that unlike Flexbox, when you change the track sizing, it's going to change it right across the row, or if you're working in a column, right down the column. And so we've got some new sizing keywords to help with sort of playing around with track sizing. And they're not just for grid layout. These sizing keywords are going to start appearing in other places, but they've been implemented with grid layout, so we can have a look at those now. So these are some interesting new sizing keywords that are defined in CSS Sizing 3. So this is another specification. What you find with new CSS specifications, they're becoming quite broken down. So we've obviously got CSS Grid Layout, and it refers to things that are in sizing and things that are in box alignment, because those features may also be used in other layout methods. So for instance, all the nice alignment stuff that we have in Flexbox is in box alignment so that Grid Layout can use it, and in the future other things might use it too. So to look at our sizing, we need to go and have a look at the sizing spec. I'm going to take a look at min content, max content, and fit content. So this is min content. I'm defining here a grid, and my first column, the first column track is sized min content, and then we've got 2 1FR columns. So min content, basically in grid layout, will display the track to be as small as it can possibly be if all of the soft wrapping opportunities are taken into account. So you can see that what's holding that track, the width of it, is the word content there, is what's making the width of that. It's wrapped as small as it possibly can. Now that's going to work right across the column, right down the column. So if there was something bigger in the box that's got 7 in it, if that would then define the size of it. It's going to look for the smallest it can possibly make it without anything overflowing. And then we have the opposite. We have max content. So max content will sort of spread everything out as wide as it can. It'll not take any wrapping opportunities. And so you're going to end up with something like this. And if it was a longer sentence or a paragraph in there, that's going to cause overflows. The thing's just going to keep on going. It's going to keep on growing. That's max content, getting as big as we possibly can get if we don't take advantage of any soft wrapping opportunities. But then we have something that's kind of in the middle, and that's fit content. So if we have a track that's fit content, in fact, I've defined two tracks with fit content here. We've got the first and the second track are both using fit content. And we have the fit content, and then we pass in a value, and I'm passing in 200 pixels. And what happens here is the track will act like max content until it gets to the size that you've passed in, and then it will stop. So we get this. So both of those tracks are using fit content 200 pixels. The first has got more content in than 200 pixels. So it starts to spread out, it hits 200 pixels, and then it starts to wrap. It's not going to get bigger. The next track, the next column track, is also fit content, but it's only got those numbers in it, 2, 3, and 5. They're not very big, so it displays the number, and that's fine. That's max content for that track, so it stops. So fit content, really, really useful. Lets you sort of play around with the sizing of your tracks. Looking at the different ways to size tracks in grid layout gives you an awful lot of power and an awful lot of ways to create interesting sorts of grids. You know, don't think, oh, it has to be like a 12-column grid, because that's what we're used to using. You've got far more tools than that, you know, to play with. So do have a play around with sizing and the different ways you can define track sizes, because you can find you can create all sorts of interesting looking things and things that don't really look like a grid. You know, when people just sort of look at that on the web page, but you've got that grid underlying, holding everything in place. But then we can't talk about this stuff without talking about old browsers, because if I don't talk about it to you, you will talk about it to me. So, so here we are, old browsers. But CSS is going to help you with old browsers because, you know, I've been doing this since before CSS. I remember Netscape 4. Anybody else? There we go. You see, we're not all just really young. So CSS it knows about old browsers. The CSS working group know about old browsers, and we're trying to help with that. So the nice thing about all these new layout methods, so Flexbox and Grid, defined in their specifications, is what they do if you have something using an older layout method and then you make it into a Flex or a Grid item. So with Grid, you might want to float things and then make those items into Grid items later. That's fine. If something's floated and it becomes a Grid item, all the float sort of properties and the way float things behave, that just kind of gets thrown away. And the same with clear. So you can have something floated, you can then turn it into a Grid item. There won't be any sort of weird floaty behavior kind of hanging around and causing you any problems. Inline block is a pretty nice way to line up a bunch of things, but you get some sort of weird problems when you use inline block because it's essentially an inline element like a word. You get white space. So unless you sort of bunch all your markup up, you get sort of problems where you can't quite line things up, you can't quite close the gap because of the white space. If an inline block item becomes a grid item, all that sort of inline type behavior goes away. The item becomes what we call blockified, and so it stops behaving like an inline item. So you can have something using inline block and then basically just overwrite that with grid layout, and that's all perfectly safe. If you're looking for fallbacks for grid, display table, making things into table cell, which lets you use vertical align. That's quite a good way to create fallbacks for very old browsers. If you need to support sort of old versions of IE and so on. Again, you can overwrite table display with grid layout very easily. One of the things that happens when you use display table cell is that you get what we call these anonymous boxes. So essentially you had like phantom boxes that you sort of didn't insert yourself in the markup to fix up the table display, because a table cell has a table row and a table around it. And they're kind of needed to display it properly. What happens is the thing becomes a grid item before those things are created. So you never get them, so you don't have weird stuff lying around that's going to cause a problem. So you can use display table as a way around. And vertical align, which works on inline block and display table cell items, if you have used that and then the thing becomes a grid item, well, vertical align does not apply in grid layout or in flex layout, and so that will just also get thrown away by the browser. And don't forget our friend multiple column layout has really good browser support for the sort of basics of multicol, and if you want to do things like lay out a set of cards or whatever, they're going to go column-wise rather than row-wise by default, but you can sort of use multicol as a bit of a fallback if you've declared column count or column width properties on a container, which then becomes a grid container. They'll just get thrown away. They won't sort of end up competing. And you potentially use flex layout as a fallback for grid layout. Flex layout's got better support than grid. If something is a flex item, then it becomes a grid item. The flex properties that are defined on the child item that's now a grid item, they'll just get thrown away. So you can use Flexbox as a fallback for grid. And of course, all of the alignment properties are the same through the two specs, pretty much. So you can take advantage of alignment if you're using flex as a fallback. And I think as time goes on, using flex as your fallback will probably be a pretty good thing to be doing. What this does mean, though, is that you need to know about CSS. You need to be able to know to use the cascade to write your CSS for old browsers, then write your CSS for new browsers. As long as your grid code comes last, browsers that understand the first stuff but don't understand the grid stuff, they'll do the first stuff. If they understand grid, well, they're going to do the grid stuff and they'll overwrite the old stuff. And so that's absolutely fine. You're not going to have any problems. Unless there are some places where your grid supporting browsers are going to use some of the non-grid code and get into a mess. Because sometimes there are things that are going to be interpreted both by old browsers and by new ones. And this is a good example. If I've floated a div and given it a width, which is what we need to do in a floated layout, we have to give things a width so they all match up, and then we turn it into a grid item, the width will become not the width of the container, but the width of the track. So it's going to go really little and skinny. So we actually need to kind of fork our code in this example. But CSS has fixed this one for you too, with feature queries. And feature queries are going to become your new best friend. They've got really good support, and we use them in the same way that we use our other overrides. It doesn't matter that IE11 doesn't have support for them, because what we're doing is we're asking a browser, do you have support for this thing? And then we write our new code. We've already done the stuff for the fallback. We're just overwriting it. So we would do this. I'm going to ask the browser, do you support display grid? It's a bit like using a media query. We say at supports, then in the brackets, what we're testing for, the property and value. So here we're saying display grid. Note that we're asking the browser if it claims to have support. We're not asking whether it's got support that actually works. We're just going to have to hope that our browser vendors have done this well. We're saying display grid, and then we write our code inside. It's just like media queries. So that's all we need to do. In this case, I'm just setting my width back to auto. In production, when I'm doing this stuff, what I'm finding is I've got a stack of selectors where I have set widths back to auto and got rid of margins because I'm using grid gap to create gaps in the grid. You're not doing a huge amount of writing like a completely different layout. I'm just overwriting the bits that are going to be interpreted in both scenarios. It's relatively straightforward once you get into that way of working, but it does mean that you need to understand CSS. How to use the cascade, how to create graceful fallbacks with minimal code. It's how CSS works, so you need to understand how CSS works and how best to structure things. If you've spent the last few years using a framework to write CSS, it's really a great time now to do a bit of catching up, to go back and look at how CSS actually works, without that sort of layer of stuff on top of it, to make sure you know how to take advantage of these things. It's really worth spending that time. I think, most people are going to be able to spend a couple of days just refreshing on how all that works and make it a lot easier to start dropping the frameworks and so on and using just the native CSS that we've got. Because really, the fundamentals of CSS haven't actually changed that much. They're pretty much the same things we've been doing for 20 years. And the nice thing about really knowing the fundamentals of CSS, it means that you can start using the new shiny stuff in a good way without causing a mess. If you've been used to using frameworks, it can all feel like a bit of a black box. So it's definitely worth having a look at what's happening in CSS and just making sure that you do understand the fundamentals of how things work. So we've also got a bunch of questions I get that are about, well, okay, so this CSS grid layout thing, it's really great, but I've started trying to do something and I can't do this type of thing or that type of thing. You know, why hasn't this yet solved all of my problems? And so I want to talk a bit about the things that we're already discussing in the working group, about what might actually come next. You know, once the level 1 spec is pretty much finished and it's well adopted in browsers, so, you know, what might come next? And the first thing I wanted to talk about really was this idea of subgrids. So when I showed the example of the balloons and the layout, and we had that caption, and it didn't line up with the caption next to it, and this is because that internal nested grid is a completely separate thing. You know, so a grid item, you can set display grid on it, you can make a grid itself, but that grid inside has no sort of relationship to the outer grid or anything else. It's just a new nested grid, and the same is true with flex items. Something that would be quite nice would be able to say, here is my grid, this is my grid for my page, and direct children of the grid can sit on it, but also their children can go to the same grid lines. That would let us line up captions and so on across the grid. So this is a good example of why we might want that. This is exactly the sort of layout you get from a designer who believes that content comes out of the CMS with perfect line lengths. You've all had one. So, you know, that's fine. And you think, well, that's a perfect grid layout. That'll take me no time at all. There's my CSS for that grid layout. That's going to be great. And then, of course, we implement that into the CMS, and this happens. And the designer says, no, that's not what I wanted. And we think, well, I'd like those to line up across the row. I want everything to line up right across the row. And we can't because the internals of those boxes aren't participating in grid layout. We can kind of make it a bit better than this. What I might do is make each card a flex item like this. And then I could push at least the footer down to the bottom of the box by setting flex 1 on the inner there. And that gives us at least this. But it's better than it was, but it's not exactly what we wanted. What we really wanted was everything to line up. If the title's got 2 lines, it should all line up across the row. If the footer's got 2 lines, that should line up. That would look really neat. Now, the subgrid spec, that was pushed into level 2, into the sort of the real rough workings of a level 2 spec, would solve this problem. So in that spec, our subgrid, our main grid, would need to have 4 rows available for each card, because the card there has got 4 elements, as you can see. So we'd need to make sure we had space for that in our outer grid. And then we'd ask for the direct child of the grid to span 4 row lines and set the value of display to subgrid. And then so basically what we're saying is use the outer grid for the internals of the subgrid, which would give us, in this sort of mocked-up example, something like this, where the elements inside are now participating in the sort of rows that are defined on the parent. In reality, we'd have to deal with the gap and so on, because gaps aren't inherited. But as I say, this is all at the moment completely theoretical. There aren't any implementations of this, but it's something that I'm very keen to see, and I think a lot of people would like that kind of ability in Grid. We just need to work out how to do it. It turns out this stuff is fairly complicated. I've written a bit about that particular feature, and these slides I'll be sharing so you can get hold of them. And there's also links there to the actual issue on the CSS Working Group drafts. All of the CSS is discussed in the open. We use issues on GitHub just like anything else. So if you have an opinion about some CSS, you can go and you can raise an issue or comment on one of the issues that we've got. So that's something that anyone can do, and it's actually really important that web developers do that. So here's another thing that people think. When they first look at Grid, they think that Grid can do this sort of Masonry or Pinterest-like layout, where sort of boxes all arrange themselves nicely to fill a space. And unfortunately, that's not quite the case, although people would really, really like it to be. So we can kind of get somewhere like that if we place each item. This looks a little bit like a masonry layout, and that's why people, I think, get confused and think that they can do this. So let's have a little look. Grid auto placement gets us part of the way there. So with auto placement, we can take a bunch of stuff, we can throw it at a grid, and grid will just place those things one into each cell. And we can even do things like I've done here, cause some of the items to span tracks, span rows or columns, and they'll lay themselves out on the grid. So we can end up with something like this. And in this case, grid is progressing forward. It's got 1, 2, 3, and then number 4, it just fits that where it can. So we're kind of getting a bit of a masonry-like view. And we can go a step further. We can set grid auto flow to dense, and then grid will backfill the gaps, which is slightly scary from an accessibility point of view because we're taking things out of their logical order, but might work for some types of layout, say a bunch of images that we don't need to tab around. But that would give us this. And it looks a bit like masonry, but it's not really masonry. It's still a strict grid with rows and with columns like that. We've still got a grid there. What masonry looks like is more like this. The items kind of stay in document order, and they sort of shift up and down to accommodate the different sizes of boxes. To do this with grid, you need to have a whole stack of row tracks available and then position your items using line-based positioning. So you can get the look, but it's not the same as having stuff and just throwing it at a grid and the browser just going, ta-da, there it all is. So currently, the closest way we have of doing something like masonry is multiple column layout, except you then end up with things down columns rather than across the row. And multicol is somewhat buggy once you end up with boxes splitting and across columns, and various suboptimal things can happen. So this is something that, again, I've written about. It's something we've got an issue raised for. It's something that's sort of been put into the level 2 rough draft, sort of saying this is something we'd like to try and solve. It's almost a bit of a mixture between Grid and Flexbox. We don't quite know how we're going to solve it. But if you've got ideas, if you care about this sort of stuff, you can always go and comment on the issue. And then a final thing that you may well run into is this idea you can't style grid cells or areas themselves. You need to have an element in there. So you need to put something in there and then style that, add borders and so on to the element. People would quite like to be able to just style the actual areas, a bit like we can put a column rule between multicol elements. Again, we've got an issue raised over on GitHub about doing this kind of idea of maybe having some sort of pseudo element that you can style. And it's in pseudo elements that we can get somewhere to that already. So this is what I want to get to. I've got a grid layout with the white panel there, and that stretches right across the layout, sort of underneath the panel with the images. Now, to get the basic layout without the background colour, I name my areas using the grid area property, and I'm laying them out ASCII art style with the value of grid template areas. And once I've done that, that's kind of my layout, and we get something like this. We haven't got the white panel, but we've got everything in the right place. And if I overlay the areas, you can see if I added the white background to the top and bottom, I wouldn't have the effect of it spanning underneath the bar with the images. And so what I really want to do is kind of be able to just style an area on the grid. I don't want to have to put something in to do that. And so I'm going to use a couple of techniques to achieve the result I want. Now, firstly, you need to know that when you use grid template areas to lay out named grid areas, you get named lines created from the area names. So each area is surrounded by named lines, and you can position things against the lines just like any other line on the grid, which is pretty handy. So I need to find 4 lines that correspond to the area covered by the white background. And it's pretty hard to annotate lines on this image because areas can have multiple lines, because obviously as the different areas bump up against each other, we get a start and end line for each thing. So we've got, the column lines there, which could be title start, content top start, content bottom start. We could pick any of those. What I want to do is find 4 lines that define my area. So I've picked the title start there for rows and content bottom end for rows, and content top start and content top end for my column lines. You could pick any of the names that line up there. I then use the line names to position some generated content. So I'm actually using some generated content, and I'm going to actually position that, sort of stretch that across that whole area. And what this also demonstrates, another feature of Grid, you can place things into already occupied cells. So you can stack those things up, and you use the index, just like absolute positioning, to control the stack. And that gives us our apparent grid area background colour. So there's lots of ways, as you start to poke at grid layout, it's a huge spec, there's an awful lot of it. And there's lots of ways we can kind of start playing with these ideas to achieve things that we might think aren't quite possible. I'm convinced there are lots of ways that people are going to start playing with this stuff and coming out with interesting ways to achieve things. And maybe some of those things will then inform what we do at the CSS Working Group to make all of this easier. And so do play with this stuff, but remember, this is all new. I've been messing around with it for years, but I've only been able to use it in production since March. And it's a big change, using something just to create little examples to teach people, to actually using it into production, solving real problems. I'm starting to discover things about the spec and how things work that I sort of hadn't been really aware of. So we're all still figuring things out. We're all still learning. So if you manage to solve a problem with new layout, write about it. Let people know what you've done. It's going to help someone else out. And if you hit an unsolvable one, write about that too, because that might be useful for making this stuff better in the future. Do write about what you've learned, share it, tell the CSS Working Group what's missing. This is your platform to create on. And I certainly want, as part of that work I do with the CSS Working Group, I want to make more things possible, because I've been doing CSS for 20 years. I still find it really, really interesting and exciting, and I enjoy sharing this stuff. And, I'd like to see what we can achieve in the next few years too. What more can we do with this platform? If you've not experimented with Grid yet, I've got a bunch of stuff that might help. Grid by Example is a site I put together, and I'm still adding stuff too with examples. There's a whole video tutorial. You can find out about all the little things that I've discussed today on that site, broken down into detail, because I know this has been a bit of a fly-through. I wrote the guides for MDN. If you like reading words rather than watching videos, that's a good place to go. Lots of stuff on my site. And Grid Bugs is where I collect the interop issues that we're finding. Grid's really stable across the implementations, but there's obviously little bits that we're discovering where it hits up against other layout methods or whatever. If you find a problem, then I'd love to know about it so that we can get it raised with the browsers and get it fixed. And if you like all this sort of stuff, I have next month a new book coming out, the new CSS Layout, which talks a lot more about this kind of stuff with layout and how to use layout in the real world. So thank you very much for listening to all of this. I hope it was useful.